Sleep Stories for Restless Minds. Welcome back to another cozy journey for your imagination. Tonight we travel to the quiet town of Hollowmere, a place where lanterns carry memories and the lake listens to every whisper. Let the fog wrap around your thoughts, and the gentle rhythm of this tale guide you into restful sleep. Now close your eyes and follow the light. The town of Hollowmere always seemed a little quieter than the rest of the world. Nestled between two slow-moving hills and cupped by the ancient arms of the hollow pine forest, it rarely made a sound that wasn't hushed by mist or softened by time. Even the cobblestones along the main road looked like they had learned to keep secrets, worn smooth by centuries of careful footsteps and weather that knew how to whisper. Every morning, before the sun reached the lake, Elias rose quietly from his cot. His room was small and filled with bits of old things, broken radios, dusty clocks, a wooden music box that no longer sang. He was 15 and thin, with eyes that always looked like they were remembering something, even when they weren't. He liked silence. He liked puzzles. And more than anything, he liked things that had once been broken and were now whole again. Outside, Hollowmere was still waking up. The fog was thick enough to trace your name in, and the Lake Winden, barely stirred. Elias pulled on his jacket, tucked a wrench into his pocket, and made his way toward the bell tower. He wasn't sure why, only that he had dreamed of the place the night before, and dreams in Hollowmere sometimes meant more than just sleep. The bell tower had been there longer than anyone could remember. It stood just outside town, leaning slightly, as if it had grown tired of watching time pass. No one visited it much, except the storyteller, a man with skin like parchment and eyes like worn coined silver. He didn't speak in straight lines. He preferred riddles, which the townspeople tolerated in the way you might tolerate a strange but harmless wind. But this morning, the storyteller wasn't there. Instead, Elias found something tangled in the wildflower grass at the tower's base, a lantern. One of the festival lanterns, no doubt, though the Festival of Light had ended nearly 2 weeks ago. Its delicate frame made of bent willow and thin, gold-dusted paper was intact, but what startled Elias wasn't its condition. It was the fact that it glowed. Not brightly, just a pulse like a quiet breath. And from inside, something shimmered, not quite visible, like an image glimpsed through a steamed-up window. He crouched beside it and placed one hand gently on the frame. It was warm. Then, just barely, he heard it speak. A voice like wind against curtains. A whisper without words. Just one soft note like the memory of a song. Elias stayed there for a long while, the fog curling around his knees, the lantern pulsing gently against his palm. He didn't yet know what it meant, only that something in Hollowmere had begun to wake up, and that somehow it had chosen him. Elias carried the glowing lantern back to his workshop, careful not to let it swing too freely as he walked. It pulsed softly through the fog, casting a golden hue on the dewy grass. From a distance, it might have looked like a will-o'-the-wisp, drifting just above the earth, with no concern for the rules of light or time. The path curved past the edge of Hollowmere, where old trees leaned toward one another like old friends sharing secrets. Here the air smelled of damp bark and forgotten stories. It was quiet enough to hear the river breathing beneath the soil. By the time Elias reached the small shed he called home, the lantern had dimmed slightly but hadn't gone out. He set it carefully on his workbench, beside a tin full of screws and a half-repaired radio. The moment it touched the wood, the glow brightened just a touch, as if acknowledging the space. Elias sat on his stool and stared at it. The lantern didn't hum or shake. It didn't crackle with electricity. It simply existed, and that alone was unnerving. He tapped the side of it gently. "What are you?" he whispered. The answer came not in words, but in a sound that wasn't quite sound, like a sigh carried on a breeze too thin to feel. A faint image shimmered inside the lantern's paper walls. Elias leaned closer. A lake. He saw Lake Winden, moonlit and still. The surface of the water rippled ever so slightly, and hovering above it, more lanterns, dozens of them, floated in the air, each one glowing with a strange pale fire. But then something changed. The scene flickered, like film stuttering, and the lanterns turned. Not floated, not drifted. Turned deliberately toward something unseen. And then the vision faded. Elias leaned back slowly. His heart thudded, not in fear, but in a deep, alert sort of way, like a clock suddenly wound after years of rest. He decided to go see Maeve. She was the town's librarian, but more than that, she was someone who never laughed when Elias said strange things. She had moved to Hollowmere only 3 years ago, trading city noise for quiet pages and a view of the lake. People called her odd, which Elias thought was a compliment. The walk to the library was short but uphill. The fog clung to the rooftops and power lines like sleepy cobwebs. Hollowmere's houses had that old-world look. Round windows, moss-streaked chimneys, porches built for sitting more than coming or going. When he arrived, the library was already open. Maeve stood at the front desk, arranging a stack of books with titles like The Anatomy of Shadows and Whispers and Waters Folktales from the Hollowpine region. "Morning, Elias," she said without looking up. "You've got that look again." "What look?" "The something happened and I don't know how to say it, look." He hesitated. "I found a lantern." "That's not unusual." "Came back." Maeve looked up now. Her expression softened into something between curiosity and concern. "Come into the back," she said quietly. "Tell me everything." As Elias stepped behind the counter, the bell above the door rang again, though no one had entered. Maeve glanced over her shoulder. "That bell hasn't rung on its own since the last time the lake froze over in June," she said. They both stood still, listening. Somewhere far off, a wind began to rise. Maeve's office in the back of the library was lined with tall shelves, not of books, but of curiosities. A brass compass that always pointed west, a jar of water that shimmered silver even in the dark, and a stone from the Hollowpine woods that, when held, felt warm as a sleeping animal. It was a quiet room built for listening. Elias sat at a worn wooden table while Maeve brewed tea in a copper kettle. She added a few leaves from a paper pouch labeled Calm Thoughts, then joined him with 2 mismatched cups. "Tell me everything slowly," she said, stirring hers without sipping. Elias told her about the bell tower, the empty base where the storyteller usually sat, the glowing lantern nestled in the grass, and the strange vision that shimmered when he brought it home. He left nothing out, not the soundless whisper, not the moment the lantern turned in the vision, not even how it had felt to hold it, like it recognized him. Maeve didn't interrupt. She listened the way forests do, without judgment, only patience. When he finished, she placed her cup on the saucer and tapped a finger on the rim. "Lanterns aren't supposed to return," she said finally, "and if they do, they're meant to be empty. Whatever yours brought back, it sounds like memory." "Memory?" She nodded. Some believe the Festival of Light was once a ritual of remembering. The lanterns weren't just symbols of hope, they were vessels. For grief, for love, for things people wanted to let go of. They were sent into the sky to be carried away by time. But this one came back. Maeve glanced out the window, toward the faint outline of the bell tower in the mist. Then maybe it has something left to say. They decided to return there that afternoon. The fog had lifted slightly, enough to see the shimmer of the lake between tree branches. Hollowmere never looked busy, even when it was, but today the streets were particularly still, as if the town were holding its breath. When they reached the bell tower, the door, usually shut with an iron latch, stood open. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and dried herbs. Dust hung in rays of afternoon light, like particles of time itself. And at the center of the circular room stood the storyteller. He wore the same patchwork cloak he always had, made of stitched-together pieces of old robes and curtain scraps. His eyes, pale and round, blinked slowly when he saw them. "I was expecting you," he said, voice dry as turning pages. "You weren't here this morning," Elias said. "Because you needed to find the lantern alone," he replied, turning to the shelves behind him. They were lined not with books but with clocks, all ticking differently, none showing the right time. Maeve stepped forward. "We think the lantern is remembering something. Do you know why?" The storyteller turned back to them and smiled, a quiet, tired smile that held too many years. "The sky forgets nothing," he said, "and neither does the lake. The lanterns know this." He reached into a pouch at his waist and pulled out a small slip of paper. It was yellowed with age and folded in half. He handed it to Elias. On it was written a riddle. If you wish to see what lanterns hide, walk where stars and silence bide. Beneath the stones and water's grace, find the room that time misplaced. Elias looked up, but the storyteller was already walking to the other side of the tower, where a door they hadn't noticed creaked open into shadow. And follow the light, he said softly. It knows where to go. And then he was gone. Only the ticking of the clocks remained. The hidden door creaked behind them as Elias and Maeve stepped through into a narrow corridor built of old brick and dripping stone. The air smelled of damp pages and sleeping moss. The lantern, cradled in Elias's hands, glowed gently, casting warm light along the walls, revealing spider webs and markings that didn't seem entirely man-made. They walked in silence at first. The passage sloped downward, the walls curving in strange organic ways, as if carved not by tools but by time itself. Small fragments of things lined the path, rusted keys, broken coins, bits of ribbon clinging to nails. Maeve stopped occasionally to examine them, whispering thoughts into the quiet. The room that time misplaced, she said, repeating the riddle. It has to be below the lake. The whole town is built around water and memory. Elias nodded. The vision I saw, it was over the lake. And the lanterns, they weren't just floating, they were watching something. He didn't say it aloud, but something about the way the lanterns turned in the vision had unsettled him, as though they weren't just returning, they were being called. The path deepened. After what felt like nearly an hour of winding descent, the bricks turned to stone, rough-hewn and moss-veined. The tunnel widened, and soon the air began to feel cooler, touched by the hush of underground water. Then ahead, a dim blue glow. Elias stepped forward, lantern in hand, and the chamber opened before them. It was vast, a wide circular room carved directly beneath the lake. In the center, a pool of impossibly still water reflected the ceiling, which shimmered like the surface above. Around the room stood a ring of tall stone pillars, each etched with symbols too old for language. And floating just above the pool's surface were other lanterns. Dozens of them. Some pulsed softly, like the one Elias carried. Others blinked in and out of sight, like fireflies stuck between dreams. Their light wasn't constant. It flowed in patterns, spiraling and weaving among themselves like a silent conversation in a language only they knew. Maeve whispered, "It's like they're alive." They stepped closer, and as they did, the lantern Elias carried began to rise. Slowly, gently, it drifted from his hands and hovered beside the others, finding its place in the pattern. The water shimmered, not with reflection, but with images. A woman in a long gray coat standing at the lake's edge. A boy losing something in the reeds. A town gathered in silence as snow began to fall in midsummer. Flickers of memory, not their own. Maeve reached out, not touching the water, but letting her fingers hover just above. It's a memory archive. The lanterns don't just carry wishes. They carry stories, ones the lake has kept. But why return now? Elias asked. From behind them came a soft voice. Because one story was never finished. They turned. At the entrance to the chamber stood a figure. She wore a cloak woven with thread that shimmered like moonlight. Her face was calm, her eyes ancient, not with age, but with knowledge. "I've been waiting," she said. "You found the first thread. Now it must be untangled." Maeve and Elias exchanged a glance. The story was only beginning. The woman stepped fully into the chamber, her cloak trailing mist behind her like a long breath. She moved with the calm certainty of someone who didn't just know the room, she had once been part of it, as if the walls and water recognized her, and the floating lanterns dimmed slightly in greeting. Maeve instinctively stepped in front of Elias. "Who are you?" The woman stopped at the edge of the pool, where the lanterns hovered in gentle, silent loops. "My name was once Mirren," she said, "but the lake gave me another name when I chose to stay weaver." Elias tilted his head. "You're from here?" Mirren nodded slowly. "From Hollowmere and not. I lived here long ago, when the festival was more than light and paper, when the town still remembered what it was guarding." Maeve's brow furrowed. "Guarding?" "The lake is old," Mirren said softly. "Older than the town, older than the stories that survived. It's not just water, it's memory. And memory has weight. It must be woven carefully or else it frays." She knelt beside the pool and reached toward it, not to touch, but to gesture. From the depths, an image rose, a field of lanterns drifting through a dark sky. Then a tear in that sky, jagged, black, and seeping something colder than night. One lantern was never lit, she said. Not properly. A wish was sent into the sky that should have been buried. It returned twisted, and now the others are returning too, not by choice, but by pull. If they're not rebalanced, Hollowmere will forget itself. And when a town forgets, it unravels. The lantern Elias had carried bobbed softly near his shoulder, as if listening. "What do we do?" Elias asked. Mirren looked at him with a sadness that held no fear. "You carry a quiet heart. That's why the lantern chose you. You and Maeve must find the 7 pieces of the broken wish, the fragments left behind when the unlit lantern was sent. They're hidden in the town, tangled in stories people no longer tell." Maeve folded her arms. 7 pieces? "Yes," said Mirren, "each one tied to a moment that was silenced. You'll know them when you feel them, like catching your name whispered by someone you've never met." Elias glanced toward the pillar-lined walls. "And once we find them?" Mirren reached into her cloak and pulled out a small wooden spool wrapped in silver thread. "Bring them here. I will weave them back into what they were meant to be. Until then, the lanterns will continue to return, and with them, what they remember." Maeve stepped forward, voice low. "Why now? Why us?" Mirren's expression was unreadable. "Because you are still willing to listen." The chamber dimmed slightly, the floating lights tightening their circle as if bracing for something. A low, distant rumble passed through the floor, like thunder submerged in time. "You should go," Mirren said. "The first fragment lies where names were once carved in stone, now worn smooth by rain." Elias and Maeve turned to leave, the lanterns dimming behind them. As they stepped into the tunnel again, Elias whispered, "A cemetery?" Maeve nodded. "Or the ruins. Either way, we have a story to find." Behind them, the pool stilled, and above them, in the fog-draped sky of Hollowmere, more lanterns had begun to glow. The morning that followed felt older than the others. Not colder, just quieter, as if the town had shifted ever so slightly overnight, rearranging itself in ways no one else noticed. Elias rose early, the scent of fog-dampened earth seeping through his window. He gathered his tools, slipped the lantern back into its carrying satchel, and met Maeve at the edge of town where the road split in two. One path winding toward the cemetery, the other trailing off toward the ruins by the southern bluff. "Which feels older to you?" she asked, her breath fogging in the cool air. Elias hesitated. "The ruins. Then we start there." They walked in silence, the kind that didn't press, but wrapped gently around them like a shawl. The fog moved through the trees in slow silver currents. Even the birds, usually chattering by now, seemed to be waiting. The ruins weren't far, just past the last row of houses, where the land sloped upward into a grassy ridge, scattered with weathered stones and crumbling foundations. No one lived there anymore, though a few children liked to sneak up on dares during festivals. The place was old, older than the town map, older than Hollowmere's founding date. Some said it had been a village before the lake had a name. Elias knelt beside a flat stone, once part of a wall or floor, now covered in moss and lichen. His fingers brushed along its surface. "Letters," he murmured, "worn away, but still there." Maeve crouched beside him, squinting in the low light. "Looks like M, T, D, or maybe L. It's hard to tell." He unwrapped the lantern, and its light spilled out softly across the stone, casting a warm shimmer. At that moment, the moss along the edges shifted, pulling back ever so slightly. The letters sharpened into view. Maeve gasped softly. "It's a name. Tilde." Then something happened. The ground beneath them gave a gentle thrum, like a note struck on an old piano, and in the air around them a shimmer formed, barely visible, like dust dancing in afternoon sun. A memory was forming. From the fog rose a vision, not clear, not solid, but strong enough to feel. A girl no more than 12 standing among these very ruins when they were still walls and windows. She was writing something, no, carving, her name into the stone with a pocket knife. Tilde. And she was crying. No sound, no words, just the shape of a tear, the curve of a lip biting back sorrow. She finished the last letter and pressed her hand to it, as if hoping the stone would remember her long after everyone else forgot. The vision faded, and in its place, a flicker of light appeared above the name, tiny, no bigger than a candle flame. It hovered briefly, then settled into the lantern Elias held. The glow brightened, then steadied. "The first piece," Maeve said softly. "A forgotten name." Elias nodded. "The first story." They sat there for a while, letting the moment breathe. Above them, a soft breeze moved through the trees, and something that might have been a sigh whispered through the leaves. Then, without warning, the sky darkened, not with rain, but with light. Far above the trees near the edge of town, more lanterns floated downward. And not all of them were whole. The wind that brushed through Hollowmere that evening carried a strange weight to it. Not heavy like a storm, but full, laden with something unspoken. A pressure in the air, like the moments before a forgotten memory surfaces. Maeve and Elias stood on the ridge overlooking the town, eyes fixed on the pale shapes drifting down from the misted sky. Lanterns, dozens of them, but not like the one Elias had found. These were dim, flickering, some twisted in the wind as if uncertain where they were going. One by one, they descended slowly over rooftops and treetops, settling into places across the town, porches, windowsills, fields, the tops of hedges. Not a sound, not a crash, just arrival. "Should we?" Elias began, but Maeve was already moving. They made their way quickly down the hill and into Hollowmere proper, where a stillness had taken hold. People had stepped onto porches and into gardens, watching the strange descent with quiet awe. A few children reached for the lanterns, only to find them cool to the touch, as if they'd been waiting there for hours instead of moments. Elias spotted one by the bakery window, its paper half torn, light flickering like a dying candle. "Something's wrong with them," Maeve murmured. "They're not settled." As they approached, the torn lantern gave a sudden twitch. Not just a sway in the breeze, but a jolt, as if responding to something. Then, for the briefest second, a sound escaped it. A low moan, barely a whisper. Not quite a word, but unmistakably a voice. Elias backed away, the hairs on his neck rising. "They're not just returning," he said. "They're in pain." Maeve looked around. Lanterns all across town were dimming, shaking slightly, as if they were afraid. Then a flash. One lantern, perched atop the well in the center of town, burst into a brief halo of light before collapsing inward, vanishing in a faint hiss of steam and ash. Gasps echoed through the village square. "No one touched them," Maeve said loudly, her voice steady but urgent. "They're not stable." She turned to Elias. "We have to get to Mirren. Now." They ran, past the baker watching through flour-dusted glass, past a row of neighbors standing in their robes, past the low stone wall that divided the oldest part of town from the rest. As they reached the bell tower, Elias could feel the lantern in his satchel growing warmer. Not dangerously, but as though it too had become aware of something stirring. The secret door in the tower opened as they arrived. The tunnel below welcomed them with its soft, echoing quiet. Their footsteps were quick but careful, the sound of distant rumbling following them like a second heartbeat. When they reached the chamber, the pool at the center glowed faintly, and Mirren stood in the same place, eyes closed, as if listening to something beneath the surface of the world. "They've begun returning too quickly," she said, opening her eyes without turning. "Something's pulling them." Maeve stepped forward. "We found the first fragment, but now the others, something's happening to them." Mirren turned slowly. "The threads are unraveling faster than I feared. Someone or something is calling them back prematurely. The stories aren't ready to be remembered." Elias stepped up beside her. "Can we stop it?" The weaver gave a long, silent pause. Then she placed a hand on his shoulder. "We can still gather the pieces," she said, "but now we must move quickly. The second fragment lies where time once stopped ticking." Maeve blinked. "The old clockmaker's shop." Elias nodded. "It's been closed for years." "Then it's still full of memory," Mirren said. As they turned to go, the lantern in Elias's satchel gave off a warm pulse, steady, strong. The first story had joined them, but there were 6 more still waiting to be found. The old clockmaker's shop stood at the edge of Hollowmere's town square, tucked between a shuttered tailor and a narrow alley filled with creeping ivy. Its windows had long since fogged over from the inside, and the painted letters on the door, Marin Son's horology, were faded almost to nothing. No one had entered in years. The story went that old Marin locked the door one day and never returned. Some said he'd left town in the night, others that time simply caught up with him. Maeve pressed her palm against the dusty glass. Still locked. Elias fished around in his satchel, pulled out a flat tool he used for clock repair, and gently worked it between the door and its rusted frame. With a soft click, it creaked open. The air inside was still. Not just unmoving, but untouched. The kind of stillness that made every breath feel loud. The scent of old wood, oil, and metal filled their lungs. Dozens of clocks lined the walls, grandfather clocks, mantel clocks, pocket watches resting in velvet trays. Each one frozen, their hands stopped at different hours. Elias stepped in first, careful not to disturb anything. A lantern hovered just above the far end of the room, tucked beneath the low rafters, its glow faint but steady. This one hadn't returned through the sky. It had waited here, patiently, as if protecting the story that remained inside. "It's different," Maeve whispered. "Not injured, just waiting." Elias moved toward it, his steps soft against the creaking floor. As he reached for the lantern, all the clocks in the room gave a soft tick. Just once. Then silence. The lantern pulsed in his hands. And then came the vision. The room shimmered around them, not fading, not vanishing, but gently overlaying itself with another time. A memory. They saw the clockmaker, an older man with narrow shoulders and spectacles slipping down his nose, working at the very bench where Elias now stood. He was repairing a small pocket watch, turning the gears slowly. His hands trembled just slightly. In the far corner of the room stood a boy, 10, maybe 11, watching, silent. His hair was uncombed, his hands stuffed into patched coat pockets. The clockmaker didn't speak, but there was something warm in the air between them. Then the clock in the corner struck noon, and everything stopped. The hands froze mid-chime. The boy's face dimmed. The clockmaker dropped his tool, stared at the stillness, and nodded, as if he had expected it. The boy stepped forward and took the watch from the table, held it close to his chest, then turned and left without a word. The vision faded. The lantern in Elias's hands pulsed once, then flickered, and something small and warm moved into it like a breath drawn inward. A second thread of memory. Maeve said softly, a promise. The old man knew he wouldn't finish, so he gave the moment to the boy. Maybe the boy became the next maker, Elias said, or maybe he just remembered. As they turned to leave, every clock in the room gave a second tick. This time, their hands moved forward, just 1 minute. Enough. Elias tucked the lantern gently back into his satchel, its light stronger now. 2 stories gathered, 2 memories returned. And somewhere in the woods beyond the town, a sound like breaking water echoed faintly, as though something beneath Hollowmere had just turned over in its sleep. The Hollowmere library had always been more than it seemed. Built of heavy stone and crowned with arched windows, it sat just above the lakeshore, like an old cat watching the water, quiet and certain. Most thought of it as a library in the simplest sense, a place of books and forgotten catalogs. But Maeve knew its layers. She had spent years sorting through its alcoves and crawl spaces, peeling back pages that had not been turned in decades. And now it called to her. They returned just after sunset, Elias carrying the lantern with both hands. Its glow was warmer now, tinged with amber where once it had been pale gold. As they passed through the front doors, the warmth of the library met them like an old sweater. Dust motes swam in the lamplight. The smell of paper, leather, and ink wrapped around their shoulders like a hush. "The archives are downstairs," Maeve said, "but there's a room even beneath that, hidden, the town's original records. Things no one bothered to digitize." "Could there be a fragment there?" Elias asked. She nodded. "If the stories are unraveling, it would be the ones we no longer know that fall apart first." They moved quickly, though never noisily. Past the desk, down the spiral stairs that curved like a shell into the belly of the building. The main archive room was lined with filing cabinets and wooden drawers, maps, tax ledgers, festival records, burial plots. Elias had never been this deep into the library before. Maeve moved to a bookcase along the back wall and pressed a series of 3 panels in a row, left, middle, right. A soft click. The case swung open like a door, revealing another, smaller room, no larger than a pantry. Inside, shelves bowed with age under the weight of crumbling folders and cloth-bound ledgers tied in string. And in the middle, resting atop a stack of unopened boxes, floated a lantern. Its paper was darker than the others. Not torn, not broken, but heavy, as though its burden had never been spoken aloud. Elias stepped forward and lifted it carefully. As his fingers touched the frame, the room changed. No wind, no sound, just a shift. They were in the same space, but the light was different. Dust shone like stars. The shelves stretched higher, impossibly tall, and a girl stood before them, no more than 16, wearing a wool skirt and a librarian's pin. She was crying, quietly but not fearfully. Around her feet were books, hundreds, scattered, stacked, abandoned. She knelt, gathering them one by one, her hands shaking slightly, and as she placed them on the shelf, she whispered their titles: The Garden of Hollowmere, A Cartographer's Grief, Songs for the Unnamed. It became clear she wasn't just shelving. She was hiding them, preserving them, from something. From forgetting. When the vision faded, Elias looked down and saw that the lantern had absorbed the glow of the room itself. It pulsed with quiet resolve. A memory of protection, Maeve murmured. Someone trying to save what the town was afraid to remember. He placed the lantern back into his satchel, now heavier with 3 stories. And just then, from above them, came a sound neither had heard in years. The bell tower? It was ringing, but not the hour. A warning. The bell in the tower had not rung in years. Not since the Festival of Ash, when an unseasonal frost covered the town in June and the lake whispered too loudly for anyone to sleep. The town council had declared the bell out of service after that, claimed the rope had frayed and the gears were rusted beyond repair. And yet now it rang. Once, then twice. A slow, mournful rhythm, 3 tones in all. Elias and Maeve stood frozen in the underground archive, the sound pressing through stone and silence alike. It wasn't just noise, it was intention. We didn't fix the bell, Elias whispered. No one did, Maeve replied. They left the hidden room quickly, the lantern glowing steadily inside the satchel, its light now tinged with a deeper hue, something between orange and rust. As they climbed the spiral staircase, each footstep seemed louder than the last. Upstairs, the library remained empty, the windows shadowed in mist. The world outside had turned gray. Not dark, just paused, like the moment before a snowfall. By the time they reached the town square, others had gathered too. Lanterns, both those that had returned and those that never left, were clustered in unnatural patterns. Some hung low near the fountain, others had perched atop buildings, perfectly still. Everyone was looking at the bell tower, and it was glowing, just faintly from within the upper windows. As Elias and Maeve approached, they found the storyteller standing by the tower's door. His cloak, stitched from old robes and festival banners, fluttered in the soft wind. You heard it too, he said without turning. It rang, Maeve said. Why? The storyteller's voice was quiet, because the stories are waking faster than they're being found. He turned slowly, his eyes distant but knowing. 3 threads have returned, and still the balance tips. One story is trying to return all at once, and it isn't whole. It wants to be remembered without being earned. Elias looked up at the bell tower, its window casting a pale red glow. What happens if it succeeds? The town will remember things it isn't ready to carry, and memory, when rushed, becomes shadow. Just then, Elias's lantern began to pulse rapidly in his bag. He pulled it out, and the glow flickered in rapid bursts, almost like a signal. The other lanterns around the square began to echo it, light answering light. Then, one by one, the lanterns began to rise. Not float. Rise. Straight into the air, like they had heard a silent call. A soft sound followed, a hum from the sky, low and trembling. They're trying to escape, Maeve said. No, the storyteller corrected. They're being summoned. High above, from the clouded mist that swirled over Hollowmere, something shimmered, a shape not quite real. A crack in the sky itself, thin as a thread but glowing like heated metal. The storyteller reached into his cloak and handed Elias a piece of paper. Another riddle. The fourth lies where echoes lie still. In halls where laughter once tried to fill. A seat without warmth, a stage without song. Where silence has waited too long. The old theater, Maeve whispered. It's been closed since the flood. Elias nodded, gripping the paper tight. We need that fourth piece, the storyteller said, before the sky remembers something it shouldn't. And with that, the tower bell gave one final, hollow toll. Then silence. The Hollowmere Theater sat at the far end of Lantern Row, beyond the old market lane where the cobblestones were cracked and uneven, and ivy had crept up to reclaim the doorways. No one had performed there in years. After the spring flood, when water filled the lower level and warped the floorboards, the town let it slip into disuse, quietly folding its stories away with the others they didn't speak of. But stories don't stay folded for long. Elias and Maeve arrived just before midnight. The mist had thickened again, pressing against the windows like a held breath. The theater's great wooden doors, swollen from damp and time, groaned softly as they pushed them open. Inside was a forgotten hush. The velvet seats, once deep red, had faded to a dusty plum. The curtain, heavy and moth-eaten, hung half-drawn. Dust spiraled in the shaft of moonlight slicing through the broken skylight above. And on the stage, centered in the empty spotlight, floated the next lantern. This one spun slowly, as if caught in a slow-motion waltz. Its glow was the color of faded roses, pulsing in time with something unheard. As Elias stepped closer, the glow sharpened, and again the world began to change. The theater didn't vanish, it transformed. The lantern's memory drew the room backward in time. The dust cleared, the seats filled, the curtain shimmered new. Laughter echoed, soft, genuine. A full house. On the stage, a young woman stood in the center, her hands clutching a sheet of paper. Her hair was pinned back with silver combs, her dress simple but carefully chosen. Her lips trembled. And though the room waited for her to speak, she never did. The light flickered. The audience leaned forward. Then the woman dropped the paper and ran. The room dimmed once more. The vision faded. The applause never came. Maeve whispered she never gave her story. Elias stepped onto the stage and lifted the lantern from the air. As his hands closed around it, the pulsing light softened into a steady glow. A fourth story absorbed, a silence finally named. Behind them, something creaked. They turned to see the rows of empty seats shifting, just slightly, as if unseen figures were rising from them. But nothing came. Only the faint smell of roses and old wood remained. They made their way outside, where the fog had thinned and the sky above Hollowmere was beginning to clear. For a moment the stars blinked down, old and wise. In Elias's satchel, the fourth lantern pulsed gently beside the others. 4 stories found, 3 still waiting. Morning in Hollowmere came gently, if it came at all. The fog was slower today, drifting like sleep that hadn't quite left. The sky was pearled over with soft light, and dew clung to everything as though the world had exhaled and never quite inhaled again. Elias sat on the stone steps outside Maeve's cottage, the satchel at his feet. It was heavier now, not just with the lanterns, but with the presents they carried. 4 stories, all glowing faintly through the canvas. 4 voices returned to a town that had long forgotten how to listen. Maeve joined him, handing over a warm mug of tea. I was thinking about the riddle from the storyteller. The first part led us to names carved in stone, the second to a place where time stopped, the third to a hidden archive, and the fourth to a stage left silent. Elias sipped slowly. So what's next? She pulled a folded paper from her coat. Another riddle, this one left pinned to her door during the night. Where wheels once turned and fields were sown, where footsteps followed but none were known, beneath the arch where no birds sing, lies the echo of a vanished spring. The old bridge path, Elias said immediately, the one that leads to the abandoned mill. Maeve nodded. That trail's been closed for years. It was used for wagon carts and grain deliveries before the mill fire. They set off together, following the curved road past the schoolhouse and the weeping willow that marked the edge of town. The bridge, once made of heavy stone and iron, stood half swallowed by vines and moss, arching over a stream that no longer ran with purpose. The mill beyond it was barely visible through the trees, its chimney crooked like an old finger pointing toward nothing. The air changed as they crossed the arch. Colder, still. Even the birds refused to sing here. Elias stepped lightly across the moss-covered planks. Near the far side of the bridge, nestled into a hollow of ivy and broken fence, floated the fifth lantern. This one was almost translucent, as though made of smoke and ice. Its glow shimmered like something underwater. As he lifted it, the forest dimmed, and the memory returned. The path around them came to life, full again with carts, workers, laughter. Children ran between wheels, tossing grain husks at one another. A woman, barefoot laughing, carried a basket of wildflowers up the slope to the mill. Then silence. The colors muted, the carts vanished, the trees grayed. The same woman stood at the bridge's edge now, her feet no longer bare, but weighted with sorrow. She held the same basket, but the flowers had withered. She looked toward the mill and whispered something the wind carried away. And then, as though the memory couldn't bear to linger, it dissolved. The fifth lantern flickered once in Elias's hands and then absorbed the echo that had remained. The grief, quiet and clean, folded into its paper light. They stood there for a while, letting the wind pass through them. Maeve broke the silence. 5 pieces found, and the next will be harder. Elias nodded. Because it's closer to the lake. She didn't answer, but in the distance the lake whispered. And the water was rising. The lake had always been Hollowmere's quiet heart. It sat like a silver coin cupped in the town's hands, reflecting sky, hiding depth. No one ever said it aloud, but the people of Hollowmere rarely swam in it, even during the warmest months. Not out of fear exactly, but out of respect. As if they knew the water had its own memories, and that stirring them might come at a cost. Now the lake was rising. Not visibly, not yet. But Maeve noticed the reeds near the shore bending differently, and Elias spotted water lapping against stones that were usually dry. The change was slow but steady, like time reasserting itself. They walked along the narrow path to the willow grove, where the trees dipped low, their branches touching the surface of the lake, like fingertips brushing a sleeping face. One tree in particular stood apart, wider, older, its trunk twisted into the shape of a question mark. Beneath it, the ground dipped into a shallow basin lined with smooth stones. That's where the 6th lantern waited. This one was wrapped in green and silver threads, its frame shaped more like a spiral than a circle. It hovered low to the earth, just above a bed of fallen leaves that hadn't crumbled with time. Elias reached for it, and the air shimmered. The memory came differently this time. Not all at once, but slowly, like a story being read aloud across a quiet evening. A man stood beneath the willow, his coat heavy with rain. He held a letter in one hand and nothing in the other. He spoke, not aloud, but into the wind. "I forgive you?" No one answered. The willow's branches shifted. He looked out over the lake, folded the letter into a small perfect square, and placed it beneath a stone at the tree's base. Then he left, and the willow swayed as though it had taken the words into itself, woven them into bark and root. The memory faded, but the sorrow remained, not sharp, but gentle, like the ache of something that ended too soon. The lantern drifted upward, touched Elias's hand, and let the memory fold into it with a soft flicker. The 6th thread found, Maeve knelt by the stone where the letter had been placed. There was nothing beneath it now, only dry earth and a single feather. "Unfinished goodbyes," she said softly. Elias looked out over the lake. One story left. "Yes," Maeve said, standing. "The 7th. And that one," she added, "will be the hardest to face." As they turned to leave, a faint mist rose from the lake's surface. Curling, stretching, it reached the shore without wind. And somewhere deep beneath the water, something old began to turn its gaze upward. The sky over Hollowmere held its breath. Clouds hovered like questions. The wind had gone still, and even the trees refused to creak. The lake, now fuller than it had been in years, rippled only when watched, smooth and untroubled otherwise, as if pretending nothing had changed. But something had. Elias and Maeve stood once more in the chamber beneath the lake, before Mirren and the glowing pool. 6 lanterns now rested gently on the surface, drifting in a slow orbit like fireflies caught in the hush between heartbeats. Each pulsed with its own rhythm, their colors blending, soft rose, pale silver, dusty gold, and deep green. The final piece, Mirren said, her voice low and even, was never given. It was taken. Elias looked up. "What do you mean?" "The 7th thread," she said, "belongs to the unlit one, the lantern that was never released, yet returned anyway, the one that began all this." Maeve stepped forward. "Where is it?" Mirren raised her hand and pointed upward. "To find it," she said, "you must go where the town once buried what it could not name, where earth and water meet beneath a false sky." Elias's brow furrowed. "The old reservoir?" Maeve's eyes widened. "The covered one. They sealed it off decades ago, said it was unstable." "Not unstable," Mirren said. "Unwilling. The structure beneath the lake was once meant to hold water, but what it held instead was memory." The storyteller appeared then, stepping into the chamber's edge like he'd always been there, blending with the shadows. "You'll need this," he said, handing Elias a final note. "Not a riddle this time, but a single word. Return." Elias closed his hand around it. Mirren looked between them. "This will not be a memory you witness. It will be one you enter. The unlit story will try to shape itself around you." Maeve met Elias's gaze back. "We go together." He nodded. The entrance to the old reservoir lay beneath a crumbling hatch behind the lake's southern edge, forgotten by most, hidden beneath ivy and stone. As they pried it open, the smell of damp stone and rust rose like old breath. They descended carefully. The spiral stair was slick, the walls wet with condensation that hadn't dried in decades. As they reached the bottom, the air grew heavier, not with moisture, but with the weight of time itself. Then they saw it. A lantern. Not floating, not glowing, just resting in the center of the room, atop a pile of stone, its paper black as soot, frame twisted as though it had been bent by something it couldn't contain. Elias stepped toward it. The moment his fingers brushed the edge, the reservoir vanished. And the world around them shifted. No longer Hollowmere. No longer present. They stood in a version of the town that had never been. A dream of Hollowmere, brighter, louder, more full of color, and yet hollow. Everyone smiled. No one spoke. The lake shimmered, perfect and still. But the sky above them had no sun. Just a flickering false light. And behind them a voice. "You're not supposed to be here." They turned. Saw Elias. But older. His eyes shadowed, his hands trembling. He held the black lantern, and he was weeping. The figure before them looked just like Elias, but taller, aged by years that hadn't passed. His face was thinner, as though worn down by remembering too much. The black lantern hung from his hand like an anchor, and the light it cast wasn't light at all. It was a kind of shadow, soft-edged and quiet, yet too full to ignore. "Who are you?" Elias asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The older version of himself looked up, eyes glassy. "I was what you might have become, if you had kept the lantern." Maeve stepped forward, protective. "What do you mean, kept?" The hollow Elias, if he could be called that, took a shaky breath. "When you found the first lantern, you made a choice to follow it. But I once chose to hide it instead. I buried it beneath the old reservoir and told no one. I thought if no one remembered the broken wish, the town would stay safe." He looked around at the dreamlike version of Hollowmere, where people moved like echoes. This is what it became, a perfect town that never changes, a place where grief is swallowed and nothing ever truly happens again. Elias looked around, noticing how each person smiled without expression, eyes unfocused, laughter trailing without sound, a hollow world built of silent stories. "But the real Hollowmere," Maeve said gently, "has always been full of imperfect stories. That's what makes it breathe." The older Elias shook his head slowly. I was afraid of what it would mean to bring back the memory that broke everything. Elias stepped closer. What memory? The hollow boy raised the lantern, and for a moment its surface shimmered like a mirror. And they saw it. A child's voice shouting into the night. A fire at the mill, not caused by weather but by accident. A small spark, a forgotten match, a runaway dog. A boy, Elias, kneeling by the embers, clutching a bundle of singed willow branches meant for a lantern that never lit. Tears. A vow. I won't let this be remembered. Maeve's voice broke through. That was the broken wish, wasn't it? You tried to send it away, but you never let it go. The hollow boy nodded. It stayed. It grew heavy. It shaped this. All of this. Elias stepped forward again, closer this time. You're not me. Not anymore. He held out his hand. Let me carry it now. We've found the others. We're ready. The hollow boy looked down at the black lantern, then up at Elias. And slowly he let go. The lantern drifted across the space between them, and as Elias took hold of it, the entire world around them began to crack, like porcelain under stress. Light flooded the sky, false and trembling. And then everything went still. A soft breath. The vision faded. And Elias stood once more in the reservoir chamber, Maeve beside him, the black lantern glowing faintly in his hand. A seventh thread found. A broken wish finally named. Mirren's voice echoed from somewhere just ahead, like a voice spoken through leaves. Return to the water. The weaving must begin. The journey back to the chamber beneath the lake felt different this time. Elias could feel it in his chest, the shift. Not fear, not excitement, something deeper, like walking into a room that had been waiting only for you, holding its breath since before you were born. The 7 lanterns glowed from within his satchel, their light seeping through the canvas like threads of dawn through heavy curtains. The 7th, black when he first held it, now shimmered with a pale, smoky hue. Its shadow had softened, as it too had begun to understand. When they reached the stone archway at the base of the bell tower, the tunnel greeted them with silence. The clocks that once ticked in misaligned rhythms had stilled, not broken, not paused. Listening. At the far end of the passage, the chamber waited. The pool was brighter now, no longer pale blue but flecked with gold and violet. The other lanterns they had returned floated gently on the surface, their glow weaving together like strands in a tapestry. Mirren stood beside the pool, robes folded neatly, her hands clasped before her. The storyteller sat nearby, cross-legged on the stone floor, murmuring to himself in rhyme, though no one was listening but the shadows. You found them all, Mirren said softly. We did, Elias replied, removing the satchel and placing it beside the water. She knelt, one hand brushing the surface. Then it's time to reweave the story. Maeve looked around the room. What happens when the stories are woven back in? Mirren gave a faint, wistful smile. The town remembers. Fully. Not just the good, not just the warm, but all of it, and by remembering it heals. Elias crouched beside her, unwrapping each lantern one by one. The name carved into stone. The clockmaker's final gift. The hidden archivist's protection. The empty stage and the unsung performance. The bridge where spring vanished. The forgiveness under the willow. And now the wish that was never sent. Each floated to the pool like leaves on a breeze, settling into place. Mirren raised the spool of silver thread, the same one she'd given Elias days ago, though now it shimmered with 7 distinct hues. As she touched it to the surface of the pool, the water began to ripple outward, and the lanterns pulsed in response. The chamber grew warmer, brighter. Time seemed to slow, then stretch, then fold inward. And then softly Mirren began to weave. She did not speak. She did not chant. Her hands moved like memory, looping thread through light, guiding each story back into the shape it had always wanted to be. The storyteller's rhyme fell silent. Maeve stepped closer, her eyes wide. Elias didn't move at all. One by one, the lanterns dissolved, not vanishing, but transforming into strands of light that wrapped around the silver thread. They did not fade, They settled, and when the last thread was tied, Mirren looked up. "It's done." The pool stilled, the chamber hushed, and outside in Hollowmere the lake receded just slightly. The lanterns that had returned drifted upward on their own, slowly, gently, like birds remembering how to fly. Above the town, a single chime rang from the bell tower. Clear, whole. And for the first time in years, it sounded like a beginning. The following morning, Hollowmere felt different, but not in any loud or obvious way. The sun, when it rose, stretched longer over the rooftops. The lake no longer clung to the shore. The mist that had once lingered thick and low now moved more freely, as though no longer burdened by what it had been hiding. The town didn't rejoice, didn't celebrate. It simply breathed. Elias and Maeve walked together through Lantern Row. People nodded to them with quiet warmth, the kind reserved for those who had done something important but didn't need to be told. Atop nearly every home a lantern hung, not glowing, not drifting, but resting, as if they had finally found their place. At the bakery, an older woman swept the stoop with a small smile, glancing once toward the lake. "I dreamed of my brother last night," she said to no one in particular. He was laughing again, like before. At the schoolhouse, children drew chalk patterns on the cobblestones, curved lines and spirals, repeating shapes that echoed the weaving Mirren had done the night before. And by the willow grove someone had left a letter. No stone atop it, just the letter, gently folded, as if the tree already knew it would be read. In the bell tower, the storyteller sat in his usual spot, a small bird now nested in the folds of his robe. He didn't speak in riddles today, only watched. Maeve led Elias back to the library, where the books seemed to breathe on their shelves, pages slightly open, as though listening. She paused beside one in particular, Songs for the Unnamed. Its spine had been repaired. The thread was silver. "I don't think people forgot out of cruelty," she said. "I think they just didn't know how to carry it." "And now?" Elias asked. "Now we carry it together." That afternoon, they returned to Mirren beneath the lake. The chamber was calm, quiet, the pool still. "Is it over?" Elias asked. Mirren smiled gently. "No, but it's whole." She gestured toward the pool. 7 small orbs of light drifted just below the surface, each one a story returned, a thread now part of the weave. The town will continue to change, but now it remembers, and memory, when accepted, becomes a kind of light that doesn't burn. The storyteller arrived then, walking slowly, humming something half familiar. He placed a folded paper on the stone ledge. Elias picked it up. A final riddle. The tale is never truly done. Though lanterns sleep and threads are spun, for hearts that hold what once was lost, will light the way no matter cost. Elias folded the paper and tucked it into his coat. He and Maeve climbed back up the tunnel one last time, their steps light. Outside, the wind stirred the trees. The lake whispered, and far above the hills a single lantern, soft gold, gently glowing, floated skyward, alone but content. It didn't return, because it didn't need to. Days passed, but in Hollowmere, time moved like softened honey, slow and smooth, unwilling to rush. The sky turned more often to lavender than blue. Mornings held a hush, even as the town returned to its usual rhythm. The bakery opened earlier. The children chased each other past the bell tower. But something subtle had changed in the bones of the place. People remembered now. Not just what was easy or sweet or golden, but the difficult things too. The hidden sorrow, the soft apologies never spoken aloud. The names that had once been lost to stone, fire, or silence were now whispered again, gently, kindly, as if returning them to the world made it a little softer. Elias found himself walking more often than usual, not with purpose, but with curiosity. One evening, while the sky was the color of ash and rose petals, he wandered to the edge of the hollow pine woods. The trees there had a hush of their own, but it no longer felt like a warning, more like an invitation. A stone path, half buried in pine needles, curved into the trees. And there, nestled between moss-covered trunks, was something new. A lantern. Not glowing, not waiting, simply resting. Its paper was woven from bark and reed, its frame curved like branches bent by time. Elias approached and knelt beside it, fingers brushing lightly over its edge. No memory stirred. No vision rose. But there was a feeling, a presence. Not like the others, not bound to a single story, but to many. A lantern that hadn't returned because it had never left. Elias picked it up and held it close. Then he saw them, not in full, but flickering behind the trees. Shapes, children, elders, shadows of Hollowmere's past, no longer needing to be found because they had already returned. They watched him, not with eyes, but with knowing. Gratitude, even. And then, like mist catching moonlight, they faded back into the woods. He stood there a while, holding the resting lantern. It didn't glow. It didn't need to. When he returned to town, he left it at the library steps. Maeve would know what to do with it. And that night, Elias slept deeper than he had in years. No dreams, just stillness. Like the town had finally exhaled. The townspeople never officially announced a celebration. But by the time the third full moon crested above Hollowmere's ridgeline, lanterns began to appear in windows again, not drifting, not summoned, but placed there intentionally. Some were old, others newly made. Each was different. Each was quietly waiting for something. Maeve noticed it first, how the children began humming the old lantern songs in the schoolyard, even though no one had taught them. How the baker had braided silver thread into the bread loaves again, a tradition once lost. Even the storyteller had stopped rhyming quite so much. He simply watched the sky. And on the evening of the festival, the one Hollowmere hadn't dared hold in years, the townsfolk came out. They wore cloaks and coats stitched with patterns not seen in decades. They carried baskets not of offerings but of memories, faded photographs, pressed leaves, toys missing wheels, poems scrawled on napkins. And in the center of the square, a platform had been built. Nothing grand, just wood and cloth and a single copper basin where the lake's water shimmered quietly. Elias stood beside it, uncertain of what to say. Maeve gave him a gentle nod. You don't need to lead it, just begin it. So he stepped forward and held up a small lantern, one of the originals, stitched with 7 threads of memory. This town, he said softly, has always remembered quietly. We whispered names, folded grief into drawers, and let light float away. But this year, we welcome the lanterns home. And with that, he set the first lantern afloat in the copper basin. The water shimmered, and the lantern rose. Not quickly, not high. Just enough to drift toward the sky like it was returning to where stories sleep. One by one, others followed. The townspeople stepped forward and placed their lanterns on the water. The basin never overflowed. It accepted each one, shimmered, and released it. By the end of the night, the sky above Hollowmere glowed like a sea of stars set free. The lake was still. The bells didn't ring, but everyone knew. Something had healed. And in the hush that followed as the last lantern rose, Elias looked up and saw a shape among them, familiar, faint. A figure waving once before dissolving into starlight. He smiled. Goodbye, he whispered, and thank you. The days after the festival of return passed like petals falling through water, soft, slow, and full of something unspoken. No one quite declared it, but everyone felt it. Hollowmere had changed. Not dramatically. Not in ways outsiders would notice, but for those who lived there, the difference was clear in the quiet moments. The old clock above the bakery ticked again, only now it kept perfect time. The children no longer feared the fog that crept in from the lake. They played in it, called it friendly. The lanterns that still hung in windows weren't reminders anymore. They were promises. Elias found himself walking more often at night. Not because of restlessness, but because the town now felt fuller in the dark, like it welcomed wandering, like it wanted to be seen under stars. One evening, as he walked past the bell tower, he noticed something new. The bell didn't chime, not that it needed to, but above the tower door, someone had carved a single word into the wood. Still, he reached up and traced the letters with his fingers. It wasn't just about quiet, it was about presence. The bell had rung when it was needed, and now it could rest. Just like the stories. Inside the tower, the storyteller sat in the same old chair, legs crossed, a worn book in his lap. He looked up and offered Elias a lopsided smile. "I wondered when you'd come." Elias stepped in, taking a seat beside him on the floor. "Why me?" he asked softly. The storyteller closed the book without marking the page. "Because you listened." Elias thought about that. Was it enough? The storyteller nodded. Listening always is. Outside, the wind stirred. Not urgently, just curiously. And in the sky above Hollowmere, one final lantern, no brighter than a candle's breath, floated gently above the bell tower, circling once before vanishing into the stars. There was a stone wall at the edge of Hollowmere no one had spoken of in years. It sat behind the overgrown garden of the old rectory, where vines twisted like forgotten sentences and birds never quite lingered. Children used to dare one another to run past it at dusk, claiming the stones whispered if you moved too slowly. Elias found himself standing there one mist-wrapped morning, drawn not by memory but by something gentler, curiosity. The fog had rolled in soft and low, the kind that carried sound far and gave shape to silence. He stepped closer. The wall was taller than he remembered, its surface chipped and pocked with time. But as he walked along its length, something new caught his eye. Thin slips of paper, just barely tucked between the stones. Letters. Some browned with age, others more recent, each folded into the cracks like seeds in soil. There were dozens, hundreds maybe. Some with names written clearly, others anonymous, none sealed. He pulled one free. The handwriting was small and careful. "I'm sorry I left before I learned how to stay. I tried to be better in the next place. Maybe I was. I hope this finds someone who remembers my laugh." Elias read it twice, then folded it again and placed it gently back in its resting place. Maeve arrived not long after, having followed his footprints through the dew-soaked grass. "Letters to no one?" she asked. Elias shook his head. Letters to Hollowmere. They sat in the quiet for a while, watching the fog slowly lift. "I think," Maeve said, brushing her fingertips along the stones, "people used to leave pieces of themselves here, the ones they weren't ready to say aloud. And now, she said, it's okay to read them." Elias tucked his hand into the satchel at his side, mostly empty now, except for a single folded note he hadn't placed there himself. He pulled it out and opened it. The writing was his own. But he hadn't written it. "Thank you for staying. Thank you for remembering." He smiled, folded the paper, and gently slipped it into the wall. "Thank you for joining us in Hollowmere, where stories return like lanterns on the wind." If you found comfort in the quiet moments and warmth in the wandering, be sure to subscribe for more gentle tales from Sleep Stories' Restless Minds. Until next time, sleep softly, and may your dreams